Going live, preparing. We're live on Facebook.
Yay.
I'm so excited to have my special guest today, Michelle
Lily.
Schenandoah. And I wanted to make sure that we could have you. Let me just make sure that we tagged you on that. Anyways, we'll be able to check that in a bit. So anyways, it's really excited because Michelle is quite the powerhouse. Even if she looks very quiet, she's moving and shaking.
I'm sharing the pages out on Facebook right now so others can watch. There we go.
Excellent, excellent. And I want to take a moment here to just tell you a little bit about Michelle, because it's really amazing to have these people that are actually at the forefront of changing what's going on in our world, like in terms of our communities, history, all the things that have happened in the world. And these people are taking on leadership and really the pioneers of change. And I'm just so excited to talk to Michelle about all the things that are going on in First Nations communities. And her, like, one of the big things that she does is she has a magazine called Rematriation magazine, and it's called and she's part of this Indigenous sisterhood, so Haudenosaunee and Indigenous sisterhood. So they're kind of like linked in all these different spheres, different people, different leaders working together, all kind of coming together almost to I get this feeling that you guys come together to inspire each other, and then you go out in your communities and do some amazing work. Would that sort of like capture a little bit?
Yeah, pretty much it does. Yeah. So I'm the founder and current editor-in-chief for Rematriation magazine. It's an online platform dedicated to Indigenous women. So we kind of have a couple of different spheres, and I think it'll encompass the work that you just described,
Yes.
called Sacred, Secret, and Shared. And so sacred is our gathering spaces where we come together as Indigenous women and healing. We have a secret space, which is like our online groups, like your private groups that you have of interest. So we have them there so we can come together, have community forum, dialogue, share relevant information for our communities. And then our shared page, which is like the public facing side, which anybody can, find on social media, Google us and find our website, and interact with all of our multimedia. So we have articles, podcasts, films. We actually are just in a film festival right now, Vision Maker Media Film Festival. And so we just premiered the first part of one of our series films that we have. So it's very dynamic.
Fast, yeah. Well, that's why I wanted to have her on this show, the CoCreativeSex Dialogues, to pick her brains on leadership and transformation communities. But I know that she's like involved in so many things. I just wanted to take her CV here and just highlight a few things because she's just like phenomenal. So basically, she's creating all these online platforms, as she said, for Indigenous women. But she's also, they've created these concepts for consulting into mainstream and First Nations communities, and work with, Fortune 500 companies, Indigenous governance. And one thing that kind of caught my attention is all this work that you've done for even on the board member of the Native American Music Awards, and you guys actually helped create the whole category of music, Native music category in the Grammys. So that's pretty powerful. So you guys are doing things with NGOs, getting funds for Indian College Fund, American Indian College Fund. So you're like, it sounds like you're really an advocacy group that really builds momentum, gets money, gets things happening in communities, and not just sit back and like complain about what's going on, but you're really action oriented in changing the landscape that's happening in the world. Would that sort of capture what you're up to?
Yeah, well, that's kind of like been, I guess, the work I've been up to for, the last 20 years. And yeah, it's really about a deeper desire to wanting to make things better. I grew up on our Indian territory. Some people call it a reservation, but our, land was unceded. And so, calling it a reservation just never made sense. So we call it a territory. And that's where I grew up. And, it
In the
was,
US, right? It was
yeah, in the
in New York
US. Yeah.
State.
So I'm on the state side, based in what's now called New York, but it's actually Haudenosaunee territories. I'm Oneida Wolf Clan. And our culture is, the ways of the Longhouse. Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse. So I grew up with my culture. And that is the richness and the wealth of who we are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
yet we've had to endure and go through, a lot of hardship for, a few hundred years now. And I think we're in this time and space where there's a lot of generations, even before me, even, they did have things harder, but everybody's always been working towards really keeping the culture, maintaining our identity, maintaining our connection and space among our lands. And so I'm just of one of those generations as well that, is just helping to move things forward. And I have yet to see what those younger ones do, who are coming up behind, my age group. So
Yeah.
a lot of activity for sure.
And I see here that you've been to the New York Law School and you went to Cornell University. You did journalism at Newhouse School of Communications. It's just like you have these like hands and capacities in so many different areas.
I'm a doer, I guess. I'm always really busy. Yeah, when I was younger, our people were in our land rights case in the US Supreme Court here, which my great grandmother and family were really very instrumental in bringing that to the courts. It was one of the very first land claim cases brought before the Supreme Courts, because before the 1950s, we had no right to bring any case into a court at all. We didn't have that ability. And so she was responsible for that. And then, I saw my grandmother, who was a clan mother, and my mom, who became a faith keeper, and a lot of my family just continuing to carry on that fight. And at a young age of 10 years old, I decided I wanted to be an attorney and work on our land claims case. So going to law school was always, the forefront of my mind, through high school and undergrad. And so I went, and I do remember my mother distinctly saying to me, Michelle, if you become a lawyer, you take an oath to uphold the US Constitution and the laws of the United States. And how can you fight for Indigenous peoples and our rights when you are basically wanting, if you're agreeing to uphold the laws of this country that is trying to take away those rights. So I actually, I never became a licensed attorney, but I have all that training, right?
Right.
So I have my JD, I have an LLM in tax law. So I specialized also in tax law. So I have, all that in the background, and I use that. I started doing some consulting with Indigenous nations and tribes across the US in governance consulting, economic consulting. And I end up having this life-changing moment for me where I was in an accident and I ended up getting this concussion, and it took me out of my work for about 2.5 years. And during that, I couldn't use that part of my brain that you needed for that, analytical skill for legal reasoning. And I also couldn't pull up my memories. So it was really hard. And after I kind of stopped fighting and trying to get back to normal, which is kind of funny because that's the state we're in right now. Everyone wants to get back to normal. Once I finally just let go of it, I realized it allowed me to be really present. And once I finally started to get present, I stopped worrying about the future, stopped worrying about the past, and the magic of life just kind of seemed to start happening. I started having fun. I stopped I just started to enjoy life, and my life just started to take kind of a whole new direction. And I feel like it was actually the path that I'm supposed to be on. And really, working among our women, and whatever it is that I'm doing right now, it's literally just been put in front of me, and I just kind of take one step after the other and follow follow what's in front of me.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about it. Yeah.
Well, could you sort of capture for us what you do right now? Like, what's the big thing that's that's important to you right now?
Well, so in the things that I just described, that sacred secret shared, there's a lot of elements that happen in all of those spaces. So we have an Indigenous Women's Gathering that has been happening every summer since the solar eclipse of 2017. And it was really called forward by years of dreams and messages that our women had been receiving. And I started to receive these messages as well. And I acted upon it. I guess I'm one of, like one of many people. You get something, you get inspired and start to take action on it. And had been calling, women together in my living room and, thinking, facilitating, talking around, what's important, and culture is number one, always,
Mhm.
our children, culture, and land were just so important. And
Yeah.
I'm hearing this message about, it's time for the women to, step forward and start taking action. So, one event would happen and another event and another event. And next thing you know, we're meeting on the lands of one of our ancestral sisters named Jigunsase. And she was the very first woman to accept the message of peace that transformed our Haudenosaunee nations to become the confederacy that we are today. And
Mhm.
this happened over 1,000 years ago. So we had a messenger, a peacemaker who traveled to our people with this message of peace. And the first person to accept that was a woman. And it's not
Mm.
surprising. There's this long lineage of women leadership that goes all the way back to our story of creation, of a woman, sky woman, who came from another place out there in the universe. And she was the very first being to come here to the earth and helped in terms of creation of what we see today. So there's a long story that goes to that. And it all like leads to this lineage of women.
Mm.
So even like me with saying that I'm Wolf Clan, right? That leads all the way back many thousands of years to very early times of human beings that can be traced all through the lineage of the women in my family.
Hmm.
And so, but where I'm going with this, when you ask, what am I doing today? Um, I go back to that gathering that we had, and that kind of really helped to call forward and unite our women among our whole Haudenosaunee Confederacy and nations that hear about our work that come to join us. And it was a real healing space. And our women hadn't really quite been united across our whole Confederacy in this way, in person, in probably over 200 years. And so it was a real healing moment. We spent 4 days together and just a lot of really great, ceremony and workshopping and healing and forgiveness. And from there, that really just transpired into a lot of other, I don't know, I just want to say it's like it's reinvigorated or reunited our networks. They were already there. There's
Yeah.
no, like, those networks were already existing. It just kind of helped to really sort of like, I don't know, add some, you know,
It
some,
almost like it sort of like revived them almost, and
yeah, it just gave
energy.
some really new, fresh, healing energy. And it just continues to grow. And women continue to keep coming forward to the work and finding, that healing. And so then, Rematriation launched shortly thereafter. And we use that space as a way to be able to help keep our sisterhood connected and inviting other Indigenous women into the space to, be a part of that healing and that unity and that unification. So it's really, really wonderful what's happening. And,
Yeah. It's like a
mhm,
real revitalization almost, right? And sort of connection and sort of that sisterhood that's really expanding
it
and
is.
gaining like momentum.
Yeah, it really
Could
is.
you share with us like what rematriation means exactly? Because I think it's really, really clear for you and probably for a lot of people. Um, like we can hear the word mother in there, remother, but we're not sure exactly what it means. And I know how vibrant an idea it is for you. So if you could share what it means for us, that'd be really great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of my very dear, friends, mentors, sister is Louise McDonald Hearn, who is a bear clan mother from Akwesasne. And she, I spent a lot of time with her, and she was talking about rematriation and also where she had learned this word from. And finally I said one day several years ago, Louise, we're going to sit down and we're going to give a definition to this, because I want this word to make it into the dictionary, because when she would talk about it, it would just be so rich and so alive and so deep and so profound. And
That's why you're so special. Like you're like, when the words exist, you're like, I want it in the dictionary.
yeah, and actually, I think that it is. I think that there is a definition
Yeah.
online now. I haven't looked it up recently,
Yeah.
but I remember I Googled something for our magazine and included the word in there, and I saw like up at the top that there was a definition, and it's actually like what we described it to be. So
That's amazing.
I certainly cannot, claim that name in any way. It's part of a movement. It's
Yeah.
part of something really special that's happening on the ground among Indigenous women. It's a process.
Yeah.
And so what we, what we came up with, and, I worked, I said, I had her describe it. She, talked for about 30 minutes, and I took as many notes as I could. And I said, okay, let me call you back. So I worked on it, and I, just kind of took all these, essential elements from it. And I also looked at the word repatriation, right? And when you break it apart, you also have the word, which is related to patriarchy, right? That's involved in that word, and it's returning a person or a thing back to, its land or owner, but that's in that male sense.
Yeah, in French it's patrie, it's almost like a
Okay.
nation idea
Okay.
in French, that word patrie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the things that Louise had shared with me is that one of her dear sisters and mentors, and now one of mine as well, is Gaji Cook, who's a Mohawk midwife. And she had been using rematriation and rematriating all of the elements of birthing, when a baby's born, and all that, that
Mm.
comes from, like, the placenta and the cord and all that wonderfulness, and returning it back into the earth, because that really is the womb for all of life. And
Right.
so she talks about, returning those elements. And so now it's also like about the people returning back to the mother. We think of Mother Earth. We think of women, coming from, our culture, knowing that women are the true life givers. And so when we think about all of what really goes into life, women hold a very special, elevated place within our culture, because of the fact that we're life givers. And we have a very special connection to the land, because the
Mhm.
land itself is a mother and is the ultimate life giver, right? And so it's returning that sacredness back to the women, to the earth, to the seeds, right? The seeds. When you
Mhm.
think about a woman, she's the one who carries all of the seeds for life within our being.
Mhm.
Literally, right from 4 months of age in utero, a female baby has all of her seeds that she'll have with her for her whole life, right? And so when you take a look at what's happened through history with our women, it's returning that sacredness to who we are as
Right.
women and as life givers, and to
Mm.
our earth as the ultimate life giver.
Yeah. Well, and I feel very privileged right now because I've gotten to know a few people of your network by working with them, and through the incubator, and I see their poetry, and I can really feel that connection to nature and the seeds and the plants and the corn, and there's a real reverence there, and it's like it really feels like the process that you're describing. It's really
Yeah.
present in their
Oh
work.
my gosh. I know, I'd love to be, sitting there, and listening in on, your current incubator. Um, because we have 5 of our, 4 Haudenosaunee, and one of our Indigenous sisters who's also, married into our people who are now in your incubator. And I adore each one. And I sat in also on your word blitz, which was really great too.
Well, what I really love about your vision is like you send them there, but then you're gonna, there's gonna be some community workshops after, and there's gonna be things happening in your community after. Like I love how you function. There's like a kind of going and get information, experiences, and then it's like spreading it and sharing it with the sisterhood and this sort of like, this group that's like allowing things like goodness into the world, it feels.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the responsibilities that we have also within our culture and the ways that we're instructed in terms of how we live, right? So we are to share our gifts. And when we receive, we also give. So, there was, luckily, we had some grant funding come through. I had just finished your incubator program. I loved it. Totally loved it and wanted everybody I know to go through it. And so I decided to create scholarships for women among our sisterhood to go through this. And I just wanted them to also be able to come back, and then let's come back and, ideate together and think of ways that we can, share some of the processes that we've learned, through your work, to be able to bring those back into the communities, to talk about sexuality, to, talk about our bodies, to talk about, what does healthy sexuality look like? It's not all just straight, sex. I mean, it's so multi-layered. And, your work really sort of helps to pull that apart and really analyze it and look at it and, talk about your own issues. And so I really appreciated that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, maybe tell us a little bit more because give us a picture of why, or maybe like more in the sense of like, what are the challenges that you feel that your people are faced with, and why this work, whether it be in sexuality, whether it be about rematriation, why are these things so important? Why is this work so important? Like, what's the context that you guys are seeing right now?
Oh, it's deep, Julie. It's super deep. I don't know where to begin.
Well, that's what I think is
I
so
mean,
great with these kind of
yeah,
situations because like like that's why your biography is so interesting because it's like you have to have such a multi-pronged approach because there's so many different layers that need to be addressed, right? So it
yeah, for
really makes
sure.
sense.
Yeah, for sure. Well, okay, so where do I begin? I know you had sent me some questions, kind of looking at, what are the challenges and the solutions and, successes and those types of things. And as I started looking at, what are, some of the, the challenges, it's kind of, I think it's really important to first look at, the history and then looking at the trauma that's resulted from it. And, in the United States and in Canada and in Mexico, and I'm sure across the Americas, there have been just so many policies to, strip Indigenous people of our identity, of
Mm-hmm.
the land. I mean, really the land first. And as a result of that, our identity in order to obtain land.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really at the core of all of it for the settlement, of folks who were coming here, settler uh, colonialism, sets in through these policies. And you have forced assimilation, you have the residential schools. I'm, grateful for what Canada is doing. I mean, I know that there's some issues and I know it can't be a perfect process, but, as compared to what's happening in the United States, which is really zilch in regard to, education of, what this country has, and the ways that it's interacted and treated and, acted in ways of genocide against Indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm.
I see that there's at least an acknowledgement in Canada and efforts to begin to educate this, Canadian citizens about that, where you don't have that in the US. So it
Mm-hmm.
requires a really big part on the part of Indigenous people to be able to raise awareness to
Yeah.
those issues and to that history. So it means we're really busy,
Yeah.
you know, to bring awareness to those things. So when you look at what has happened, you know, because of, you know, a few hundred years of, you know, genocide, forced assimilation, what you end up having now as you flash forward are these communities. Number one, we're still here. We're lucky, you know, and very fortunate to still be here. And that's just a testament of our ancestors and their resiliency and their willingness to continue to hold on to our ways and our identity.
Yeah.
And, but it wasn't easy, right? And so one of the things that I've learned about in my work in these past several years, which I never ever heard of as a kid growing up, but trauma and intergenerational trauma, right? So those are a new way of understanding why we're at where we're at today. So growing up, I just didn't understand some things, right? You know, there was just a lot of maybe, you know, chaos or violence that I would see. And I just didn't understand it. It's like, why is it that we have this beautiful culture, you know, that, you know, espouses peace, you know, love, kindness, making things right. And yet my world that I see around me doesn't reflect that, you know, that talks about, you know, great, you know, reverence for women. Wait, what, you know? And so I had to kind of really question those things. And that's kind of what set me on this course to arriving where I'm at now. And so intergenerational trauma, I think really, really helps, you know, us as Indigenous people, but also for non-Native, non-Indigenous people to understand that you know, trauma, intergenerational trauma can go back many, many, many generations. And also when you look at, so let's say when a woman is pregnant, and let's say she's pregnant with a girl, right? And that girl, at, like I just mentioned earlier, at 4 months has, you know, all of her little eggs, you know, inside of her as well. So let's say now that that woman experiences some type of violence or trauma in her life. You know, she's, you know, forced on, you know, 1,000-mile walk, you know, across, you know, the country to new lands and had her home destroyed. You know, what does that do to those eggs, right? Because that's the grandmother, the mother's in the womb, and so is the, you know, the grandbaby. So right there is like 3 generations that are impacted by an event that happened. So it just, it's cyclical and it carries on. And so what could have happened to your ancestors, you could be experiencing feeling now, right? So I know your work does a lot around the body, getting into the body. And, you know, we carry a lot of that trauma. It's wired right into, you know, our being. So we can experience things like anxieties and stress and, you know, tensions and fears and pains. And that could be something that you're carrying that wasn't even yours, right? So how do you come to undo those things? And that's a lot of the work that I feel that, you know, our women are doing now. And it's so awesome to see because a lot of our men are also starting to step up and address this type of work as well. So yeah.
So like what kind of healing work would the women do together when they come together? Like what would that look like, and how would that transform their experience in their everyday lives?
Well, there's a lot of different type of work that's happening. Um, it could, you know, I've gone from, you know, just workshopping together, looking at our common, you know, shared histories. And sometimes that can have the effect to help people to see that, oh, what I went through, they went through, and they went through, and they went through, right? Or creating talking circles, which has the same type of effect. And you realize you're not alone. That is so important. You know, you're not
Start drawing
alone.
this bigger picture that makes sense.
Yeah, and understanding like what happened to you. So for instance, I'm a victim of, you know, sexual assault. I don't like using the word victim, but that, you know, that happened to me by a close family member. And, you know, as, you know, when I was growing up, I just couldn't understand, why did this happen to me, you know? And I went, you know, years trying to find healing for myself. And I, eventually came to understand all this other history, about residential schools and so forth, and understanding like I can trace back, that sexual abuse all the way back to residential schools, because what had happened to me had happened to the person, who had harmed me. And, it goes back. And so that's what I'm saying, like violence ends up, being, cyclical, and
Yeah.
realizing that, it's got to break somewhere. So instead of having victims and perpetrators and go to jail and
Yeah,
all that, because that model's not working. It's not
exactly.
working. Yeah.
Exactly. So in the US, like were there like a big wave of residential schools that happened?
Yeah,
Like
there
you know, like
were.
in Canada, there were a lot of them across the country. Like
Parallel to
parallel to,
Canada. And
right.
that's so unfortunate, because the US really does not want to, reveal its dark history. It just doesn't want to talk about it at all. But there were, oh my gosh, I can't even remember, but it's definitely well over 100, schools, and over, 100,000 students that, went through the schools. And there were, thousands of students that died, that never, never made it home. And it's really sad going to see, Carlisle is like one of the more famous, schools, here in the US. And it's so sad, because you go there and there's a cemetery, and these are the only schools in the whole country that have a cemetery for children in them,
Wow. Wow.
because those children were never able to go home, and they were
Mm,
forcibly taken away from their families, and they were, forced to, to assimilate, to become white Christians. The
mhm,
motto for the schools was to kill the Indian and save the man.
mm.
So I know there's a really big education in Canada about, the residential schools and
Which
what
is a
happened.
new one. Like I think it's just in the past 10 years that it's really been out there, you know. I think it's
And it's
still piece.
parallel.
Yeah,
It's literally parallel to what happened here in the U.S.
right,
Yeah.
right. And when you talk about the sexual activity that sort of could be stemmed back from the residential schools, was it, you know, that there was sexual violence happening in the schools, or was it the
Oh yeah,
frustration? And
absolutely. Yeah, the sexual abuse was really rampant in the schools. And so the schools, really their mission was to have Indigenous people to assimilate, to be white Christians, to go move into the mainstream, and never to return home. But what, the government and these missionaries were not expecting was that most all of those students actually did return home. And so when they came home, they didn't understand love and affection, because they were torn away from that as a kid. So they never knew what is the love of a mother, right? That's rematriation, returning, the sacredness of, our mothering ability to give our kids that type of love, right? So you can see, like, for those kids who went to the residential school, there's like a disconnect, so what does healthy affection look like? How do you give love, right? So they lived in these places that were literally run by the US Army in some spaces,
Hmm.
or run by Christian missionaries who just really were very strict. But again, yes, there was lots of sexual abuse and physical violence against
Mhm.
these kids. So that's what they came home with, and their behavior towards their children and their family. And then you can
And it's
just
like it's almost
get
like this thread, you know, when you have like a wool sweater and you start cutting the threads and then the whole sweater kind of gets unraveled, you know. That's
sure.
kind of how I see it. Even like a sexual act that's inappropriate can cut one of those threads, you know, and it's just and then the ramifications are so wide ranging, you know, and the whole family, community,
Yeah.
next generation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so now, like, actually talking about sexual violence is still relatively new in our
Yes.
communities.
Yes.
So when that happened to me, as a young girl, it took me years to be able to actually even talk about it, and to realize, like, actually what happened to me. And once I finally came forward and talked to my family, I really expected them to be there for me, right? Help
Mhm.
comfort me, talk through it, something, right? And
Yeah,
what I discovered or what I found was that there was lots of silence
right.
and not knowing what to do. And I was like, wow, like what's wrong with my family? Because normally they were always so very loving and, there and want to talk about it. And it took me years to finally realize, oh my God, it happened to them too, and they didn't ever get a chance to talk about it at all, like
Right.
nothing.
Yeah.
And I think that was more common across all of our communities, more so than anything. And so, coming forward to talk about sexual abuse now is, it certainly takes a lot of courage. There's a lot of victim shaming, and that is also, I think, a result of, you know again, going back to the history, because the person committing these assaults against our own people is exactly that. They're relatives of ours, they're
Hmm.
close family members, they're leaders,
Hmm.
they're cousins, they're uncles, and so there's a lot of shame that comes because that doesn't feel right, right? Like that's not what's supposed to happen in family. Or
Hmm.
there's also protecting family members,
Right.
and so there's been this blaming the woman has always really been very easy, and that happens in every culture, right? Like, she asked for it rather than believing women.
Hmm. Hmm.
But again, that's patriarchal thinking.
Right.
And because it's been okay for men to behave this way, in European cultures, men, had rights over women, and it was not an illegal thing for a man to rape his wife. Like, she didn't have the ability to say no, right? She was property. And so when you look at how assimilation, and patriarchal thinking has made its way into our communities, that's part of what has also carried forward, and not believing women.
Right. And that kind of like that's why rematriation is such a powerful concept, because it allows this kind of shifting of the paradigm back towards that lineage of, like in sort of Iroquois Confederacy, it was very much of the women were so part of the political process, right? They had such an important say, and they were clan mothers, and
Yeah,
they
they
were
were the
really
say.
revered.
They are the say.
Yeah.
And our clan mothers really are, they are the mothers to all of their clan members, and listening to what are the needs of the people, being a mother to a community. I mean, what does a mother do? She's there to tend to the needs of her children and helping them
Mhm.
to grow, and to listen to them and to help guide them and direct them. And so she really has a gauge on what's going on within her clan, and
Yeah.
she would take this, or still does take this, and bring this to her chief, and help to guide him. And he really is the eyes and ears and for the people, and the voice. She really tells him and guides him on what he's instructed to say.
Hmm.
And so she's really in charge. So I think that's the
Hmm.
important thing, is that the women are in charge. So what I find interesting, and I always like to tell people, and to bring to their awareness. People like to say, among the Haudenosaunee, that women, were equal to men. And it's like, no, 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 no. That's the wrong way to look at it, because it's a very much a patriarchal way to look at our communities, because it's making first the assumption that men are greater, as from that Western European
Yeah.
lens. And no, it's actually, when you look at it through our lens, you first start with the women and understanding that they're life givers, and that we have this
Mhm.
elevated status among our people. We are all equals as human beings on
Mhm.
this planet, right? That's how we see it. We're equal in our responsibilities that we have to
Yeah.
carry forward out into the world, and the responsibilities that we have to the land, and all regenerating life. But
Mhm.
because we're life givers, we have this this elevated space.
Yeah.
And
Well, what
men.
I love is really comes from this place of reverence, finding the essence of things and having reverence for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so men have to work to be able to live up to that space in terms of, being in and among the presence of women and his conduct, and showing
Mm,
that respect for life and showing that respect, towards
mm,
the women, and showing that, to, our creator and to all of creation, that he will live here, in balance and walking with that respect for life.
mm, hmm. And how did the Me Too movement sort of have an impact in the First Nations communities? Did that have a wave come through the communities as well, or?
It did. Yeah, it absolutely did. So you can see also one of our films that we created. It's free online on our website, rematriation.com. It's called An Indigenous Response to Me Too. And so when the Me Too movement hit, I was paying, close attention as, someone who has been, sexually assaulted as well. I was like wondering, like, okay, how is this going to impact or affect our communities, right? And also working in media, and just with the work that I've done in paying attention to what would happen with the Indigenous narrative in this bigger space of the Me Too movement. And what ends up happening a lot is the mainstream will often either pull our narrative into the mainstream and then we sort of become invisible, or it does not address us at all. And
Mm,
so as I was watching this unfold, I don't know if, I'm sure there in Canada, you saw it on the New York Times. They started to develop a list of all of these, perpetrators. And then I remember sitting at Facebook one morning, and I was like considering whether to share that and to say, are our communities ready for, something like this? And I realized the responsibility of sharing that at that moment. And it was still a very, very new,
mhm.
it wasn't so new because it obviously had been started years before by a Black woman, Tarana Burke, I believe is her name. And then it sort of got co-opted by, this, movement that came out a few years later, and really sort of took away from that intent. So the Me Too movement became about sexual abuse in the workplace. And I knew that Indigenous communities, it's not about sexual abuse in the workplace.
Mhm.
It's about sexual abuse in our communities. And I knew that it came from a very sort of different place and
Yeah.
reason. And so in one of our women's gatherings, we had a summit, we talked about this movement. And I decided then to create this film to be able to put our own narrative out there into the space before Indigenous communities were even addressed in regard to the Me Too movement. Because a lot of our women and even our men from across our communities were starting to hashtag themselves saying Me Too, right?
Mhm.
And I knew it was not about what was happening at work. It was about what was happening at home. So
Yeah.
yeah, it just kind
Yeah,
of
I think at
addressed
one point
all
it kind of became just anyone who's been sexually assaulted,
yeah.
you know? But can you give us a little bit of a description of what you kind of explored in that documentary?
Well, yeah. So we talked about, where it comes from, and just like I described, with the residential schools and the history and, the genocide. But then we talked about, the role of men, within our communities. We talked about accountability and
Mm,
how we take accountability and, looking at restorative justice rather than, the system.
mhm,
We talked
mhm.
more about, what did our, traditions really, what can they tell us about restoring justice, right? And taking a look at how do we start to be more proactive in our own communities to be able to address the issue, and also just to start to create healthy individuals, right?
Yeah.
And so it took us all the way back to the young people, to the youth, and really starting to work with our youth to help them to learn more about the culture, be able to talk about sexuality, and really kind of focusing in on even their rites of passage. And really helping them to identify culture. So we really looked at talking about um,
Mm,
the Me Too movement through a cultural lens.
Right.
So yeah.
So it sounds like you were also like kind of bringing in the culture to look at what would be the solutions that we could have, as opposed to just polarizing the communities,
Mhm.
finding sort of like a thread that would be able to move the situation forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So I recommend taking a look at the film. If
Sounds good.
yeah, it's a 28-minute film. It's free. It's online. And it was also really meant to be a conversation starter to actually
Right.
start to talk about the issue. You know, kind of going back to, you know, me when I was younger, we didn't have any tools to be able to talk about this issue.
Hmm.
Right. So I think that's one of the things I think about a lot, are like, what are the kind of tools that we have as human beings to be able to address these tough subjects, not just
Yeah.
sexual abuse, but the tough history as well, or the
Yeah.
things that happen today. Like, what kind of tools do we have in our own homes as
Hmm.
parents, as communities, to be able to talk about these issues, and not always be about like blame,
Hmm.
but really more about like, okay, let's look at the issue and, you know, find ways to be able to talk about it, get our emotions out about it, and then kind of find ways to help us to move, you know,
Forward. Well,
forward in a way.
what would this accountability look like? Like, how would that help someone in a community? Could you give an example of one of these situations?
Well, I think, you know, one of the things is like making things right. That's definitely, you know, a teaching from within our culture. And, you know, it's sort of like, if somebody is responsible for harming another person, is like, you know, come forward and you know, take responsibility for harming another, and then, you know, really kind of, you know, taking the cues from maybe the family, from the person who was hurt. You know, what ways can I do things as a better person myself
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
order to make things right with you? So if I've harmed you, Julie, you know, like,
Hmm.
what can I do to, you know, help make things better in your
Hmm.
family? So, you know, the violence that happened, you know, to me, end up resulting in my family being very broken, very, very broken, because, you know, my siblings were all very young, and we didn't have tools to deal with it. So, you know, unfortunately, you know, there was a lot of harm that resulted from that. And, you know, myself and my siblings and my mom, you know, like, we're still, you know, all these years later, kind of putting the pieces back together. How could it
Yeah.
be different? Well, maybe if that person, you know, had come forward to really genuinely say, I'm sorry, right?
Yeah.
Like, what can I do to make things better? It starts with asking, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's like in the ideal sense, and I think it's very possible with certain people. And then there's some people that seem so like deeply hurt in their situation that there's something so deeply that almost becomes pathological. Like, how would you see that play out? Like, if someone just really can't, make something right and just keeps on creating harm in the world.
Well, and, you know, and then there's also some cases where those things happen as well. And, you know, then thinking about, you know, instead of it being, you know, a victim perpetrator and it just happens between these two individuals, it ends
Yeah.
up being communities. It ends up being
Right.
families, you know, networks of people. And
Yeah.
how can the families and the networks and the communities that are around these people also help them? Because if it is
Right.
somebody who is so seriously, severely hurt and traumatized that they can't help themselves but to hurt someone, is like, well, how
Mhm.
can we come together as community to help them heal, rather
Right.
than just, you know, lock them up in
Isolate
jail
them.
and
Yeah.
throw away the key, right? So
Yeah.
that's one thing. I don't know how it is in Canada, but I know here in the United States, like, that's, you know, that's just the model. It's like, you know, put people in jail and let them be there, and they
Mhm.
don't really find what they need there. Their
No.
soul needs healing too. Chances
Yeah.
are, at a very young age, they were hurt, they were
Yes.
traumatized, and just have
Exactly.
never been able to recover from that.
Mhm. So I don't know how much this has come onto your radar, but there's a whole conversation about trafficking as well. Have you had conversations in your sisterhood about the trafficking of First Nations women?
Yeah, actually, there has been, for sure. I mean, it happens here in the United States as well, probably more so than we see. It's still something that I think is a new conversation, even more so than talking about sexual abuse. And it's something that is like in plain sight sometimes that people don't even realize it. So it's still, a fairly new conversation in some spaces, and in some communities, maybe some that are closer to, bigger, cities might have, more information about it. But it's definitely worth talking about because it's happening, right? I mean, I know that it happens, among all races, and I know that it happens here within the city that, where I'm at. So
yeah. Well, I mean, it just takes someone that's vulnerable, and if the community has been broken down through different policies, it just leaves people at risk, right? So it makes it
yeah,
easier to create situations that pull people in.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of situations where it creates a lot of vulnerable individuals. I know that, there are some states where, children are just being taken out of their homes at very young ages, taken away by the state, for really, for causes that they really shouldn't be taken out of the home, like really, really super high rates. Then once they end up in these foster homes, then they're really without true
Grounding.
parenting and grounding. Yeah, exactly. And so they're put in these very vulnerable spaces, and really left open to a lot of these harmful things that can happen.
And so, like, what are the kind of things that you feel like, wow, these have been successes in our communities, like this transformation? Because, I mean, it's pretty epic to see a culture have that resilience, survive, and start creating these kind of networks, starting to transform things, create new ways. It's almost like anyone that's gone through trauma and has been able to transform is a new person than someone who's well and has never had to go through that. There's something transformed, there's something deepened and embodied. So I'm curious, like, what kind of things have you seen in your communities that are like success stories that you feel that you're ahead of the game and you can be of service,
Yeah.
to sort of like create new ways for our society and mainstream society?
Yeah, well, I know that one of the things that we had talked about in the film, the Me Too response film, was about the rites of passage, and I had mentioned earlier a clan mother.
Like for men and for women?
Yeah,
Yeah.
for all young adults when they're coming into puberty, to help them learn how to become an adult, how to express themselves in very healthy ways, and but really ground and orientate themselves within our culture. And that really is where the greatest success is because we find our greatest strength there in terms of who we are as people and why we're here on this planet, right? We
Right.
believe and we know that every individual came to this earth with a purpose, and that we have certain gifts that were given to us by creation. And so mainstream culture really takes away from our ability to see what those gifts are, because everybody's instructed and directed to walk in one path, and success is defined by money and whatever, all these other things, and it's not really defined on who you are as an individual and what inherent gifts that you have that you can give to the world.
Right.
So by cultivating those gifts, you then share them with the world, and the world gets to experience them and benefit from them. So it
Yeah.
creates this reciprocity. You become a very healthy and grounded individual by living into your gifts and sharing them with other people, um, rather than kind of following a formula, or a pre sort of determined path, just designed by some type of institutions or degrees or whatever you have it. So that's kind of a really, really big distinction.
Mhm.
Living out
What
your
would
purpose
what
and why you're
what
here.
would some of those initiations look like?
The rites of passage.
Yeah.
Well, those are really like, the young people will come and they'll spend several months dedicating themselves to learning about our ceremonies, learning to even talk about healthy relationships. What do they look like? Learning about, their reproductive systems, learning about, for both sexes, and understanding you know, how to have that kind of respect for yourself, that
Yeah.
respect for others, that
Yeah.
respect for, you know, the other sexes, and how to walk as an Ungwahua person in this world, as an indigenous person, as a Haudenosaunee person.
Mm.
And then the young people, you know, will go out in fasting, and they'll, you know, deprive themselves of food and water, and it allows them to separate themselves from all those things that we think that we need in our daily lives,
Mhm.
and really help them to sit and to be quiet with themselves and really start to hear their own inner voice. And
Mhm.
so they'll go through that through a series of years, until, you know, they reach a point where they've, you know, sort of graduated, so to speak, and then being sent off into the world to go live into those things that they've learned about themselves. You know, so
Mm.
starting there, you know, you could even start, you know, even literally from, you know, it's said, you know, that women, you know, our bodies is the first environment for our babies, right? And so, like, right from literally from conception to a child growing, they learn so much from their mother. So having very healthy women within our communities builds strong nations.
Mm.
That's a fact,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the greatest gifts that Indigenous peoples, I mean, even especially as Haudenosaunee people, that we have to offer to the world is understanding, you know, what it means to have strong, healthy women, and what that type of leadership that results from following just those very natural life ways that we live,
Mhm.
is understanding that first environment that we have.
Well, I really feel that the importance of reverence, and it's the reverence for life and the reverence for this healthy, wholesome um, paradigm, and it's the trick, I guess, is like, how do you get to those places? But I feel that the way you guys are doing all your coming together, sharing, doing the ceremonies together, the workshopping, it's like this kind of transformation of maybe some of the things that were, really hurtful from history, and
Yeah.
to find that new voice and find that voice of that's grounded and in that life process.
Yeah, well, it's actually kind of like really, you know, finding our voice as individuals, but also carrying forward that voice of all those women and our ancestors before us, right? Like all that leadership that has made us into who we are today, right? So I like to tell people that as we're looking out into the world, you know, that it isn't going to be, you know, some new study that's going to, you know, save us, but, you know, talk to Indigenous peoples, because you know there is a life way here that, you know, we know works, right? Like we've lived it for thousands of years. We know what the language is related to the land where our feet are, right? So I like to ask people all the time, where are your
Mhm.
feet? Whose land are you on? Have you talked to those people? Because they know the ways of the land where you're at, and they
Mhm.
will help to orientate, you know, you as, you know, visitors here on the land, you know, to come and to live here in peace, and to understand, you know, the life ways of living there in that area that you're in.
Mhm. So let's say, from like in your neck of the woods, what would you like to say in terms, is there a message you'd like to share about like what it is to be on your land?
Well, so we've been, you know, living matrilineal and matrifocal ways since the time of creation of human beings here on Earth. And when, you know, the Europeans, you know, came here, the very, you know, early, you know, settlers and colonists had learned so much from us, that the founding fathers of the United States actually formed the United States government based on the Haudenosaunee form of governance. So
Mhm.
the Constitution is very much a reflection of our form of governance. And
Mm.
that you will not really find in history books. You really, really have to go search for that,
Mm.
because it's not common knowledge. But in
Mm.
addition to that, when you look at women's rights, the suffragists were influenced by Haudenosaunee women. The
Mm.
suffrage movement, women's rights movement, happened here within our territories because they saw our women, they saw how we lived, they saw the full autonomy that we had over our minds, our bodies, our spirits, our children, the land, our homes. Like, it was ours, right? We didn't have to go consult a man on, any of those types of decisions about ourselves. And so they wanted to be able to live in the way that we did. And so they were very much inspired by who we are. And so I think it's really important, because when you look at real freedom, when you look at true democracy, and you look at inclusion, and you look at equity, you can see the Haudenosaunee influence that has moved around the world, but most people don't know this.
Well, it's interesting because I've always thought that, like, let's say the more feminine qualities, not the feminine that's the warrior, that goes out in a more like, or the teacher that's holding that more of a masculine position in a way of power, but that more gentle or grounded or wise, or all these qualities that women can have about seeing and intuition. Like, I always feel that they're kind of they're these qualities that you need to have space enough to see and respect, or else it just gets bulldozed over.
Sure.
And so I just feel that, yeah, you need to have a culture that has reverence for this, or else it just gets squashed out. It gets bulldozed, basically.
Yeah.
So it's nice that it's in the structure of the
Yeah.
culture.
Well, one of the things that, I also like to point out to, people is when they're talking about women's rights and fighting for women's rights, there's always, this thing about this fight for equality, to be equal to men. And I say, ladies, why do you want to fight to be equal to men? You're more than that, right? And so if you're fighting to be at that same status of men, I remember one time I was speaking at this college, I said, if you want to be equal to men, then you need to be ready to, be treated the way men treat each other. And all the men in the room were like shaking their head, like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's about really, looking deeper into the culture. The clan mother, I've referred to a few times, she likes to point out to groups that she's talking to that if all people really look deep within their culture and really go back, everybody's indigenous. She says everybody, wore, had feathers, at some point. But if you go back, that everybody sort of had this divine, feminine within their culture, and that all women, not from here in these, territories and on Turtle Island or North America or within the Americas, have this great female strength if you can trace it back, far enough. And to go and to look to that as your inspiration and your power, because it's not in the space of, being equal with men. We're very different, we're very, very different creatures. And I think that that's one of the things that maybe we have to, acknowledge.
And so I know that you and your husband have a really beautiful relationship, and that you work together as consultants. And so how do the power dynamics play out between you two? Do you find a really good way of putting into practice those values?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, because our consulting business is really, it's called Indigenous Concepts Consulting. So we're always, just like this talk we're having tonight, it's having many more of those out in the world, whether we're, doing public talks or we're writing articles, but it's really helping to bring this perspective out into the world. So, he's a matrilineal man, right? He was raised this way. So he understands, what it is, to live this way and to embody it. And so we're always supporting each other and really helping to bring this voice and this perspective forward.
Yeah. Well, I think it's this, I want to just throw this out maybe as a last question to you, but I know there's a real worry about a lot of men out there that are worried about being emasculated by women. And I'm just curious what you think about that.
Well, I can say this, that my husband doesn't feel emasculated and that, men who live within our communities that, grew up within the culture, they don't have that sense about them. When we look at the responsibilities that we have as human beings, right? And when we live into what, our instructions as human beings, we each have certain responsibilities, right? And if we live into those, then we're not in this space about trying to fight for who's in power, but
Right.
we're paying attention to what we need to be doing, caring for community, caring for the land. And it's really a little bit unfortunate, because when I talk about our ways, and that our women are responsible, really initially for our children and for our homes, like, to a feminist perspective, that might sound kind of very archaic and like moving back in time. And it's not. It's really not, when you can realize the power that you have as a woman, as that life giver within your home, and what
Well,
type of
especially if you're
have.
honored by the whole community too.
It's
You're
very
not just like
different.
left behind because you're in the home, kind of. You know what I mean? There's a difference there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of interesting. So basically, the way like you really focus on the different responsibilities, and there's this mutual respect, as opposed to like I'm trying to fight for my power, therefore I'm going to dominate you, and no, I'm going to dominate you back, and it's not in that realm at all. It's more like there's
Yeah.
this kind of responsibility, and how do
Yeah.
we honor each other in that?
Right. And the other thing for men is to recognize that, women aren't a threat. And if men can recognize their responsibility, or excuse me, their responsibilities as protectors of life, they will then become protectors of women, right?
Mhm.
So when we look at the connection of life, when we look at, Mother Earth, we look at women, right? These are all life givers. And right now, in this time in which we live, the greatest life giver right now needs all of us to, all hands on deck, to
Mhm.
really live into those responsibilities to help protect, those life-giving qualities of the earth, because we've all, as human beings, pretty much almost all, like, just abandoned them, and we live, these very, modern, lifestyles, which was all about consume, and and behind all that consumption is all this exploitation,
Yeah.
on the land and on human beings. And so we're not really being protectors of life like we should be. And so
Mm.
if we can start to move in that direction, we're not all fighting and scrambling for, who's in charge of those types of things, but we're
Mhm.
really focused on protecting life. And, in
So,
that regard, men don't need to worry and women don't either. We just have
right.
responsibilities and duties as human beings.
So what would like a modern man in your community that espoused these qualities, what would he like, how would he show up like in relationship and in leadership? Like what would that look like?
Well, there's some really beautiful examples of men who are living in that space now that, I'm just wowed by them all the time. There are men who are there showing up for ceremony, that are, making sure that, the fire is going for, the whole time that it's happening. They're making sure that, all of, the heavy, hauling and lifting and moving and, getting of, resources to where they need to be in order for the people to eat and the people to, to gather and to be together, that those things happen. But also, like, being there as a community member, being there as a healthy human being who speaks, softly. There's a saying that I was reminded of by one of my sisters earlier this year, that we're supposed to talk to each other in a way that feels like warm water.
That's
Right.
beautiful.
So if I think about these men, and they're very gentle beings, they speak very gently to the children and helping
Mm,
to guide them.
mm,
They're very, very respectful of women. I've seen, them, adopt women to be a father figure. There's so many people that don't have fathers, right? They're being father figures and good uncles to others that maybe don't have a healthy male in their life.
mhm.
And they're being there to support their wives or the women in their lives to be able to do this type of work that's happening within our communities.
Mm,
So for me, that's what I see as those really healthy beings,
yeah.
and they live fully functional lives with regular jobs too. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, just like that picture of knowing that there's this masculine force that has my back, or that has
Mhm.
that generosity or that care, is like so soothing and relaxing. It just can let your whole nervous system, you don't have to be the one always trying to cover for everything. It's just
Yeah,
it's a nice balance to
it
have
is.
that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
That's amazing. So, how about this? Is there any words of wisdom that you'd like to share to sort of close up this conversation that you feel like are really important for us to know and to understand?
Well, I've said a lot tonight in regard to the time that we're in, and I think it's really important that we as human beings, begin to acknowledge each other as human beings and recognize our relationship to the earth, recognize, the voice of each other, recognizing the voice of the indigenous peoples whose lands that we're, upon, and really acknowledging, what is needed, what's needed in community, what's needed in this time and space. We've been given this huge break in our way of being, and it's giving us all ample time to reevaluate our lives and how we're living. Do we have healthy relationships within our own homes? Do we like the institutions in which we're working in every day? How can we change, those things? How can we change, the simple things from within our homes to where we work and how we live, and how can we start to really live better for those future generations ahead of us, because it was those ancestors who were thinking of us, right? And that's what we always, talk about within our culture, is thinking 7 generations ahead of us, right?
Mhm.
So is our conduct right now as human beings, is it living in a way that will create space for 7 generations ahead of us to have this type of life, or better than what we're living? What kind of legacy are we leaving here on this planet? In terms of the environment and in terms of, how we conduct ourselves as human beings. So I think it's really important for us to not just live for ourselves, but to live for those generations ahead of us. And
Mhm.
so that's where I'll leave it for this evening.
Well, it was amazing talking to you, and I love your breadth of knowledge and all the different and your capacity to communicate it. That's it always has impressed me, actually. You have this capacity to bring all these thoughts together and delivering it in such a simple way, but it covers all the nuances. So I just want to thank you for all that that picture that you drew for us, and
Yeah.
hopefully we'll have other conversations
Yeah, well, I
and
look
other
forward
things
to
to live.
that. And I have to say, Julie, I want to also thank you, because I really, really respect and appreciate the work that you have done and how you've put your gift out into the world. And so, for anyone who has not yet, picked up your book or encountered your work, I definitely encourage folks to check it out, because it's really, really, it's life changing. And I just want to say thank you for dedicating yourself in the way that you have, because it's opening up a dialogue for humanity to be able to talk about ourselves in ways that we haven't. And I think that, in regard to how we live and how we function in this earth, like, you're sort of really opening up the door in one of those spaces that helps us to just really uncover, you know, many, many deep aspects about ourselves that have either been hidden, hiding out there in our subconscious, and finding really healthy ways to be able to talk about them and to empower ourselves to live healthy lives. So I just want to
Thanks.
thank you for that. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate that acknowledgement. That's really
Yeah.
sweet of you. Well, I loved hanging out with you, and hopefully we'll have other occasions to do that.
Sounds good. I look forward to it. Yeah. Thank you, Julie.
Much
All right.
love. So
Much love to you.
I end the Facebook Live, but stay around so I can give you a big a virtual hug. One
Sounds
second.
good. All right. And now, everyone,
Bye,
thank you for
everyone. Oh,
joining.
and next week we have a guest it's a surprise, but we're going to be talking to a man, and he's going to bring us in the realm of like the men that looks like, everything their life looks so amazing. They have this big real estate company, and they can make beautiful homes, and yet he's going to tell us about some of the shame that he's just uncovering and owning authentically in the world. So I'm really excited to talk to him because he's a real voice of authenticity And it's just refreshing to see that in the world and hear men be able to step into that and have that kind of openness to share. So I'm excited. So I'll keep a little bit of a secret, but just giving you a little bit of a taste, so you'll come and be on our next podcast next week. Okay, love you lots, and talk to you soon.